going to be reading from Luke, the 14th chapter, beginning at the 25th verse. And there Luke writes that large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Or suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Well, won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, 'This person began to build and wasn't able to finish.' Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with his 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Well, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have, you cannot be my disciples." You know, I heard about a guy recently. His name was Bob. It seems that Bob lives with his father, and together they run their successful family business. When it became apparent that Bob's dad wasn't going to live much longer, Bob decided to find himself a wife with whom to share his soon-to-be newfound wealth. So one evening at an investment meeting, Bob spots the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. So, he sort of sidles up to her and he says, I may look like an average Joe, but before long, my old man's going to kick the bucket. And then I'm going to inherit $200 million. And impressed, she asked for Bob's business card. And 3 days later, what do you know? This same beautiful woman became Bob's stepmother. She married Bob's father. Now, there's a woman who had a plan for success, huh? I like what former ear-biting heavyweight boxing champion Mike Tyson has to say. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And I wonder what Bob's plan became once he got punched in the face by his new stepmom, taking all that inheritance away. Most of us have gotten punched in the face a time or two. Let's think of Labor Day. I was reading recently about some of those punches, about all of the American jobs, that are disappearing due to technology, due to foreign competition. For instance, did you know that as you pick up your cash this week at your local bank, that little ATM that you get the money out of, that little convenient device, that's now doing the work of 180,000 bankers who've lost their jobs in America? How about the U.S. Postal Service? Site recognition machines have replaced 50,000 postal workers. How about foreign competition? Thousands of apparel workers and financial analysts, they've been coerced into training their foreign counterparts, who will then work for a fraction of the hourly wage of an American worker. Talk about a punch in the face. Folks, our world is changing. None of us can count on a lifetime of security. We used to have maybe a job our entire life. So we got to be prepared, because experts are telling us that if you are a person between the ages of 18 and 44, you can expect to have an average of 11 different jobs over the course of your life. Folks are losing well-paying jobs. They're having to settle for careers in low-paying situations. In fact, career counselors are telling us that today's workers are going to need to begin to think more like entrepreneurs. In other words, we need to take responsibility for our own careers. We can't leave it up to our employers. Yeah, making a living has always required diligence. Let's take Jesus. He knew what it took to be able to survive in the workforce. After all, let's remember, before his ministry, he was 30 years old. So most of his life he would have worked. And we think about what the Bible said. He was a what? And most of you will say a carpenter. But actually, archaeologists are now saying that Jesus was more likely a stonemason. A what? A stone mason. And how so? Well, in the original Greek, in the old King James Version, the word for builder was the word tekton. Remember, when the King James was being translated in England back in the 1600s, most homes there were made out of wood. So the biblical word tekton or builder was translated, of course, carpenter. But in actuality, let's remember a couple of things. First off, at the time of Jesus' boyhood, historians tell us that a lot of Israel, his homeland, had been denuded of trees by the Romans. That meant that the people of that culture had to build their houses out of stone. It was an extremely readily available building material. Secondly, the word tekton is the root word from which we get our word, tectonics, which is the study of all those rock plates, underneath the surface of the earth shifting around. So if tectonics has to do with rocks, then don't you think that the translation of the word builder should be stonemason, not carpenter? Finally, one more helpful fact. Just a few miles across the valley from Jesus' hometown of Nazareth was a pretty good-sized Roman city of that day that I've been to. It's called Sepphoris. And folks, Sepphoris was being built around the time of Jesus' boyhood. And it was made almost exclusively out of stone. And since Jesus' daddy, Joseph, was a stonemason, he was a contractor, most likely every day, Joseph took Jesus to where there was work. Folks, the amazing stone amphitheater that my wife Cindy and I got to see in Sepphoris may have been built in part by Jesus and his daddy. So as Jesus was growing up, his dad was preparing Jesus to be a contractor himself. Not just a hired hand, which means before his ministry, Jesus was probably quite successful. He understood the business world. Likely for years, he had to run the family business after Joseph died, because Joseph does disappear. He ran it before he finally was called to the other family business by his heavenly Father. And that's all to say that today's story from Luke, it sort of reflects Jesus' business background. Let's recall, many were starting to follow him. And yet they didn't seem to understand what they were getting themselves into. And so Jesus decides to give them a sort of a reality check as to how he lays out in no uncertain terms what the cost analysis was going to be if you were going to be his disciple. Let's take a look at Jesus' opening salvo in today's lesson, because, folks, it is a shocker. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, and yes, even their own life itself, such a person cannot be my disciple. And on the surface, we hear what Jesus is saying, and his words, they sound so contradictory to what we know about him, or at least what we think we know about him. But then we recall that Jesus, he often used such startling paradoxes to make a point. Jesus often would state a principle in a graphic way to be able to get his hearers' attention, and then he would leave us to sort of have to find the answers. He wanted us as listeners to think. And so certainly, in light of New Testament teaching, Jesus here isn't demanding hatred of his followers. We're getting a call right now. Okay? It's one of those It's one of those bad dreams for a preacher. And that's why I don't carry my phone anymore into worship. Because there have been times when I had my phone on vibrate, and it was while I was preaching, and I was thankful I was the only one who could feel it. But I always had a bad dream about the time when it would go off, and I would have it on my hip and say, God? So we're thinking, back to get us on track here, okay? We're thinking about what Jesus just said to us in verse 26 of our passage. And let's face it, he couldn't very well command, honor your father and mother, and then demand that we also hate them. He couldn't command, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, and then advise us to hate our spouse. Jesus, who so loved all the little children, that he took them in his arms and he blessed them. He couldn't advise us as parents. I mean, I'm looking at my wife back here with our 2 daughters and our grandbabies. He couldn't advise that we hate our children. There's no way that we could do that. Nor could he counsel his disciples to be reconciled to our brothers and then encourage us to have brotherly hatred. I mean, how could he command love your enemies and then call us to hate our friends? In fact, Jesus even recommends that we should even hate our very own lives. And yet, assuredly, Jesus couldn't have been suggesting something so psychologically destructive for our own existence as loathing ourselves. No, of course not. So what was Jesus saying? Folks, Jesus was saying paradoxically, our love for him, it has to be so great that our love for ourselves and for our families needs to seem like it pales in comparison. Literally, we are to subordinate everything, even our own being, to our love and our commitment to Jesus Christ. He must be our first loyalty if we are to be his disciples. All other relationships have to take second place. And yeah, let's face it, Jesus' words, they shock us. Because if we're honest, then many of us would have to admit that we love our spouse and our kids more than we love God. And we miss the mark when we end up putting their development athletically or intellectually or artistically or socially before their spiritual well-being. We fall short when we spend more time in the car, in one day shuttling them to games and lessons, than we do in a month growing their souls. Yeah, by comparison, perhaps our lives reveal, could it be that we hate God and love our children disproportionately? If so, Jesus says, you cannot be my disciple. I have to come first, he says. So Jesus has spoken of the relational cost involved in following him. But then he shocks us even further by laying out the sacrificial cost. Once again, listen to what he says. Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. And friends, I don't need to remind you that the cross was an instrument of execution. It was like Jesus was saying, he who does not hoist up his gallows or his electric chair and follow me cannot be my disciple. But I tell you, dear ones, for those who tread its path, discipleship is a series of deaths. It's a perpetual dying. Disciples must embrace sacrifice and suffering. It's a daily part of a disciple's life. It's what it means to pick up your cross and follow. And no, self-denial, let's face it, it isn't a popular topic these days. Just to be honest, take a look at the shortfall in our church budget. And it says it all. And that's why 2 Sundays from now, we're going to embark on a 6-week sermon series starting on September the 18th. We're going to go back to the basics by looking at the 6 marks of what it means to be a disciple, the 6 sort of benchmarks by which we can measure what a healthy, growing disciple of Jesus should look like. So we're going to focus on 6 topics that begin with a G, stuff like going and growing and glowing, giving and groups and grace. Our leadership, who met a few weekends ago out at Pine Trail Camp, we became of one accord on this, that we have to move forward as a growing, intentional congregation of Christ followers, that we have to transform the culture of this church definitively in a new direction. Because to stay where we are is going to mean a slow and gradual death. And I'm not saying that it's going to be easy moving from here to there, folks. It's going to mean sacrifice. The cost of discipleship won't be popular. But you know what? If we who claim to follow Jesus, if we are not willing to pick up our crosses, then who are we really? We're not disciples. We're only pretending. We're only playing at church. Because Jesus said it himself. You will know them by their fruit. That not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father. So in a few weeks, we're going to begin to look at what such fruit should look like. But for now, having challenged us with the cost of discipleship, Jesus, he then uses 2 little parables to encourage us to count such a cost. Once again, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Well, won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and you're not able to finish it, everyone who sees it is going to ridicule, and you're going to say, oh, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Well, won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with his 10,000 to oppose the other one coming against him with 20,000? And if he isn't able, he's going to send a delegation while the other is still a long way off. And he'll ask for terms of peace. Well, in the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Yeah. Jesus is stating a solid spiritual principle here in practical and recognizable terms. Because as a businessman, Jesus knew that people fail in business and people fail in life, and the reasons are usually the same. I love the guy who said, you know, I started out on the theory that the world had an opening for me, and I was right, because today I'm in a hole. That's some kind of opening, isn't it? Because the person who doesn't sit down and count the cost, whether that's building a tower or building a business or a strong spiritual life, we can find ourselves in a pretty deep hole pretty quick if we're not careful. Let's take the builder of that tower. Or how about that king deciding to go to war? Well, they both needed to sit down and consider carefully their course of action, their strategic plan. That's the very thing that our leadership did a couple of weekends ago. And why? Because just as that man who began to build that tower and then wasn't able to, and he got all that ridicule, there's a guy who got started and wasn't able to finish. So it's amazing how many people fail to plan. That old adage is true. Those who fail to plan, what? Plan to fail. Yeah, successful living, it begins with a plan. And as a successful businessman, Jesus knew about that. Let's take a businessman, newspaper man, Lionel Burley, back in the 60s. He's pretty unhappy with the trash that's being published in England, so he starts with his own newspaper. He calls it the Constitutional Sentinel. For weeks, he writes these articles. He promotes the paper on billboards. He sells advertising space. He prints 50,000 copies. He's absolutely determined to make his first edition a success. And so on February the 6th, 1965, after the paper had left the printers, an exhausted Lionel Burley was resting in his hotel room when he gets a phone call from the London police. Mr. Burley, there's a mountain of your papers sitting outside the entrance of the Brown Hotel. They're blocking the street. Because it seems in the hundreds of things to attend to that Burley had overlooked one critical detail. He didn't get a distributor. Nobody was out delivering his newspapers. There they were, sitting in the middle of the street blocking traffic. Needless to say, his paper folded the next day. And yeah, Burley was probably a nice guy, but his plan, it wasn't completely thought through, was it? Like that man who ran out of money building that tower, Burley didn't take all the contingencies into consideration. Friend, let me ask you, how much time do you spend planning for your future? You know, some folks spend more time planning for a vacation than they do planning for their eternity. Sometimes we get so busy with life that we forget about what's really important. We need to carefully consider the cost of the daily choices that we are making. Because as you've perhaps heard me say before, we are seeking as a congregation to transform our earthly minutes into eternal moments. We want to be able to experience the blue chip kind of stuff in our lives, don't we? That's what we want. So let's think about two questions that we're going to have to answer as we seek to plan with foresight for the eventuality of our eternities. First off, one of these days, folks, you and I will be leaving this world. And when we do, first, what will be our legacy? How will folks remember us? In what ways will the world be a better place because we've been here? Will we just, sort of live out the string of our earthly minutes, or will we discover the power and the joy of something deeper and richer, living a daily life that's filled with eternal moments? Stephen Covey, in his book, The 7 Habits of a Highly Effective Person, says, we begin with the end in mind. In other words, if you were to die tomorrow, what would you leave behind? Are you planning with that in mind? Which of your values would you want to pass on to your heirs? And are you living those values out right now? And when you reach the end of your life, will you have a lot of regrets? What will folks have to say about you? Folks, these are the big questions that we have to answer. Author and business guru Peter Drucker says that his life was shaped at the age of 13 by a teacher who asked him, "Peter, what do you want to be remembered for?" And he didn't have an answer. And his teacher said, "I didn't expect you to. But if you still can't answer when you're 50, then you will have wasted your life." Folks, right now there are more than 80 million baby boomers like me in the U.S. who find themselves in midlife. And as a result, this has created a huge interest in midlife reevaluation. We're sort of shifting from me to we and from take to give. Psychologist Erik Erikson, he called this shift generativity versus stagnation. The need as we approach the end of life to live beyond ourselves. And folks, it's the kind of worldview that I think Jesus demanded of his followers. Hey, you want to follow me? Then pick up your cross and deny yourself. That's the kind of eternal legacy that Jesus wants his followers to leave in their wake. In fact, I think that Jesus, he would have liked the advice that Congresswoman Claire Boothe Luce gave to John F. Kennedy back in 1962. A great man, she said, is a sentence. A great person is a sentence. Abraham Lincoln's sentence was, he preserved the Union and he freed the slaves. Franklin Roosevelt's sentence was, he lifted us out of the Great Depression and he helped us win a world war. And Luce, she feared that Kennedy's attention was becoming so splintered among different priorities that his sentence, it risked becoming this sort of muddled paragraph. Friends, as you contemplate your purpose for being, your plan for life, secondly, I want you to ask this big question. What's my sentence? And you know what? Former NFL great Bubba Smith came face to face with his sentence, and he didn't like it. After retiring from football, he was recruited to appear in ads, remember, for Miller Lite beer. And he and his NFL buddy Dick Butkus, they were cast in these commercials. They recited the virtues of Miller Lite with lines like, and I also love the easy opening cans. But then Smith walked away from that job because he didn't like the effect that drinking had on people. He realized that he was contributing to a major social problem. He said that alcohol had never been a part of his life. And yet here he was making money espousing its virtues. So one day he goes back to his alma mater, which happens to be what? Michigan State University. And as he rides in the limo up at the front of the homecoming parade, he hears all these throngs of people on both sides of the parade route. And they're shouting back and forth, tastes great, less filling. Tastes great, less filling. Remember the Miller Lite slogan? And he realized the impact of what he was doing on young people. So when it came time to renew his contract, he refused to sign. A voice inside said, "Stop, Bubba. Stop." He didn't want the sentence he would leave as his legacy to be, tastes great, less filling. And so he walked away. Friend, one sentence will one day sum up your life. He loved hanging out with his friends more than his family. She kept a spotless house. He had a bad temper. She wore the cutest outfits. But how about if that sentence was that you counted the cost as worthy of being Jesus' disciple? How'd you like that on your gravestone? Folks, in today's gospel lesson, Jesus addresses those considering becoming his disciples, and he wanted them to understand what was involved because he needed people who were not half-hearted about their faith. He wanted folks who were willing to leave everything if need be. So as we wrap up, years ago there was a remarkable little village in southeastern France. It was called La Chambon. And what made this village remarkable is that its residents literally risked their lives to protect the Jews during World War II. In fact, in later years, documentaries were made about them, books were written, but the villagers, they tended to get irritated by questions that made their risk sound noble or praiseworthy. What else would you do? They responded, you do what needs to be done. Isn't that a great life sentence? You do what needs to be done. Just such an eternal moment. It took place amidst the horrors of 9/11. It involved a passenger on United Flight 93. You remember the one that crashed in that Pennsylvania field? And that passenger, his name was Tom Burnett. He called his wife from that hijacked plane, having realized that 2 other planes had already crashed into the World Trade Center. And he said, I know we're going to die, but some of us are going to do something about it. What a great life sentence. I know we're going to die, and we're all going to die, but we're going to do something about it. That's a heck of a one-sentence legacy. What will your legacy be? What one sentence will define your life? Are you living right now so that that legacy might be achieved? Jesus said, whether you're considering building a tower or an enduring faith life, that you need to first count the cost involved. What's your life plan? When it's all said and done, are you living according to the sentence that you once said about you? Pray with me. Father, when it's all said and done, what will be said about each of us? May it be said simply that we were your disciples, and we picked up our crosses, and we followed. And if that can be said, then that's a life worth living.